Chinese lacquer has really attracted attention, not just in modern times, but really for any trader that has come into China going back to the ancient world. Now, the lacquer that the Chinese use comes from the Chinese lacquer tree. It's actually the sap of the tree. In different countries, for example, India, you have a different source. In the West, we have shellac, which actually comes from yet another source. And these trees can vary, but basically they're using the sap. Once it's cooked down and properly refined, you get a very hard material. It's going to be impervious to water. It's going to be impervious to age. It really tends to preserve the underlying material. But keep in mind, you never make something from pure lacquer. That has its own setbacks and problems. And you can color this lacquer any number of different ways. You can color it white using calcium carbonate. You can color it red, as we're going to see, yellow with yellow oxide, black with lamp black, basically the ash from oil lamp, or you can use simple charcoal. But you can basically color this material any color you want. So let's look at some of the lacquer techniques that they use. We will see what is in the West called coromandel, which is painting landscapes, birds, and other designs on a plain colored background. So what they're doing is they're lacquering the surface, they're bringing it to a high polish, typically trying to remove all the brush marks and everything else. And then they paint over that, and that would be coromandel. We also see Diotia, and I apologize for my pronunciation. And this is a design that is carved into the lacquer and then painted. And so you can see that here where we have multiple colors, even though there's probably one color of lacquer that's been used. Then we have an inlay technique where they are painting the lacquer in place and then cutting into it in that typical inlay form, which we've talked about. And they're inlaying all sorts of things, mother of pearl, which works really well, gold, silver, ivory, just about any material that you can think of. Generally, it's going to be a precious material. The advantage of inlay is I'm putting a very thin piece of material in place, which means while it looks incredibly expensive and opulent, in reality, there's not that much that went into the piece in terms of materials. Then we have so-called Peking lacquer. And this is red lacquer that is made up of multiple layers of lacquer. We'll get into the construction in a minute, up to 36 layers, and then intricately carved in a relief form. So in other words, they're carving into the finished lacquer without getting into the underlying piece. Now, in the West, this is often referred to as cinnabar. And this is a specific lacquer. It's your typical Chinese lacquer, but with a specific pigment. And that specific pigment is mercuric sulfide. In the West, we would call this vermilion. And mercuric sulfide is really nasty stuff to work with, but creates this really rich, vibrant red. And what they're going to do is they're going to take their object. It could be metal or it could be wood. And more typically, traditionally, it's going to be wood, but we do see metal objects used as well. They're going to coat it with that lacquer over and over and over again. And you have to coat it thinly. If you don't, it's going to slump. In other words, it's going to start pulling off of the surface while it's wet, creating massive drips, basically, in the surface. If you use different colors, you can get this very interesting sort of relief to it, giving us a sense of depth using, in this case, black under the red. And you see this with vases, you see this with candle carving, you see this with any number of other Western techniques. But in this case, they're using lacquer. And I should point out that the lacquer is fairly easy to carve, so it works pretty well. And when you're looking at this, we see a lot of reproduction pieces. Usually these are made of resin. There are two ways to find out what you're dealing with. First of all, if it's an actual antique lacquer piece, it's going to be incredibly smooth. There shouldn't be any brush marks. There shouldn't be any air bubbles. If there are air bubbles, it means it was poured. It means it's a resin. Also, If you're familiar with the person who owns it, you can use some alcohol in an inconspicuous place and use a cotton swab and see if it picks up a little bit of that cinnabar color. If it does, then it's real because you've actually dissolved a tiny amount of the lacquer, although I don't recommend that technique. Also, keep in mind these are hand carved and hand worked, so you should see that. You should see marks from the blades that are used, the chisels that are used, etc.